Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most urgent messages. When 61-year-old Clay Tanners lost his wife, his ranch felt more like a graveyard than a home. On what seemed like another empty morning, 2 yellow lab puppies appeared at his fence, whimpering desperately. These weren't strays looking for food. They had something important to say. Clay followed their frantic steps into a ravine where he discovered a wrecked truck hidden deep in the brush. Inside were 2 young people who had been missing for 3 days after a flash flood washed out the main road. The puppies had somehow survived the crash and climbed out to find help. As word spread and paramedics arrived, the dogs became local heroes. But for Clay, they became something far more precious, a reminder of what it means to have purpose again. What Clay didn't know was how these 2 loyal souls would completely transform his quiet, lonely world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay Tanners had been rising before dawn for 43 years. But these days, the habit felt more like a burden than a blessing. The old brass alarm clock on his nightstand, a wedding gift from Margaret, still chimed at 5:15 each morning. Though he'd been awake for the past hour, listening to the house settle into its familiar creaks and whispers. The silence had weight to it now, pressing against his chest like a heavy blanket he couldn't quite throw off. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the first hint of light filtering through the gauze curtains Margaret had sewn 38 years ago. She'd always said the morning light in their bedroom reminded her of butter melting in a warm pan, soft and golden and full of promise. Clay couldn't see it that way anymore. These days, light just meant another day to get through. The ranch house had been built in 1967, the same year he and Margaret married. They'd planned it together, room by room, dreaming of the family they'd raise within its walls. The kitchen would have a big window overlooking the pastures, so Margaret could watch the horses while she cooked. The front porch would wrap around the house, wide enough for rocking chairs and afternoon conversations. The spare bedroom down the hall would become a nursery, then maybe 2 nurseries if they were blessed. But blessing, Clay had learned, was a complicated word. They'd been blessed with 38 years together. They'd been blessed with good health and a successful ranch operation. They'd been blessed with neighbors who cared and land that provided. But the one blessing they'd prayed for most fervently, children, had remained just beyond their reach. Margaret had never complained, not once, though Clay caught her sometimes standing at that kitchen window with a faraway look in her eyes. Her hand resting unconsciously on her flat belly. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Clay padded into the kitchen. Margaret had programmed it the night before she died, just like she had every night for decades. He'd never changed the timer. Somehow that small ritual of hers continuing on without her felt like a tiny rebellion against the finality of loss. The coffee was always too strong now. Margaret had been the one with the gentle touch, but Clay drank it anyway, standing at that same kitchen window she'd loved, looking out over the 2,300 acres they'd built together. The Tanners' ranch sat in a valley 15 miles outside of Cedar Ridge, Montana, where the Bitterroot Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the western sky. It wasn't the biggest spread in the county, but it was well tended. Clay ran about 200 head of Black Angus cattle and kept a dozen quarter horses for ranch work. The operation had been profitable for decades, though the money mattered less to Clay now than the routine. Work gave his hands something to do, and his mind somewhere to go besides the empty spaces Margaret used to fill. He dressed slowly, pulling on the same faded Wranglers he'd worn for the past week, the same chambray shirt that hung a little looser than it used to. Food had lost most of its appeal since Margaret passed. She'd been the heart of their home in every way, the one who filled their table with pot roasts and fresh bread, who remembered to buy groceries and plan meals and make sure Clay ate something besides beef jerky and black coffee. Now he survived on whatever he could heat up in the microwave, though most days he forgot to eat until his stomach started gnawing at itself. The back door creaked as he stepped onto the porch, his boot heels echoing hollow against the weathered boards. Margaret had always wanted to paint the porch, a soft blue, she'd said, like robin's eggs. They'd talked about it every spring for 20 years, but somehow there was always something more pressing that needed attention. The fence line that needed mending, the barn roof that needed patching, the tractor that needed parts. Now the unpainted porch stood as a monument to all the small dreams they'd deferred, believing there would always be more time. The morning air carried the scent of pine and sage, got through with the earthy smell of horses and hay. Clay's breath misted in front of him as he walked toward the barn. September mornings in Montana had a bite to them, a reminder that winter was never far away. Margaret had loved this time of year, the way the aspen leaves turned gold and the sky took on that particular deep blue that seemed to exist nowhere else on earth. She'd made him promise once to scatter her ashes in the high meadow where they used to ride together on Sunday afternoons. He'd kept that promise, though the trip up there had nearly broken him. Inside the barn, his horse Ranger nickered softly from his stall. The big bay gelding had been Margaret's favorite, though she'd never admitted it out loud. She'd always claimed she didn't play favorites among their horses, but Clay had seen the way she saved the sweetest apples for Ranger, the way she'd linger an extra minute brushing his coat. Ranger seemed to sense the change in the household too. The horse had always been eager for his morning rides, but lately he seemed as reluctant as Clay to begin each day. "Morning, old friend," Clay murmured, running his hand along Ranger's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, and for a moment Clay felt a flash of the contentment that used to begin every day. Animals had a way of cutting through human complexity, of reducing everything to simple needs and honest affection. Maybe that was why he'd always preferred their company to most people's. He saddled Ranger with the same efficient movements he'd performed thousands of times before. The leather was soft and well-oiled, the bridle worn smooth by years of use. These were the tools of his trade, extensions of himself and his life's work. But they felt heavier now, weighted with memory. Margaret had given him this saddle for his 40th birthday, having it custom-made by a craftsman in Bozeman. The tooled leather bore his initials and a small heart she'd asked the leather worker to add her secret way of going with him on every ride. The sun was just cresting the eastern ridge when Clay led Ranger out of the barn. The world was painted in shades of gold and amber, the kind of morning that used to make his heart sing with gratitude. Now it just reminded him of how beautiful Margaret had found mornings like this, and how much she would have loved to see this particular sunrise. They rode toward the far pasture where Clay planned to check on the cattle. It was routine work, the kind he could do in his sleep, but it filled the hours and tired his body enough that he could sometimes actually sleep at night. The horse moved beneath him with familiar rhythm, hooves finding their way along paths they'd traveled together for 8 years. This was the life Clay had built, the life he and Margaret had shaped together through decades of shared work and love, and small daily choices. But as they approached the fence line that separated his property from the old logging road, something was different. Clay reined Ranger to a stop, squinting in the morning light. There, pressed against his fence, were 2 small shapes that definitely didn't belong. 2 puppies, yellow as field corn, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Clay had always been good with animals, but he'd never been one for strays. The ranch was isolated enough that they rarely had problems with wandering dogs, and Clay preferred it that way. Animals meant responsibility, and responsibility meant caring, and caring meant the possibility of loss. He'd had enough loss to last several lifetimes, but these puppies weren't just wandering. They were trying to tell him something, whimpering and pawing at the fence with an urgency that made Clay's weathered heart skip a beat. Their golden coats were dirty and matted, their small bodies trembling with something more than cold. These weren't lost pets looking for food. They were messengers with news he needed to hear. As Clay dismounted and approached the fence, one of the puppies, a female he thought, stood on her hind legs and placed her front paws against the lowest rail. She looked directly into his eyes and whimpered, then turned and took a few steps toward the ravine that ran parallel to the logging road. When Clay didn't immediately follow, she returned and repeated the gesture. Her companion, slightly smaller and clearly her brother, joined in the strange dance of communication. Clay had spent his entire adult life reading the language of animals. He knew when a horse was favoring a leg before it showed any visible signs of lameness. He could tell by the way his cattle bunched together when a storm was coming hours before the weather service issued warnings. And right now, these puppies were telling him something important. The fence was old but sturdy, built to keep his cattle in and predators out. Clay found the gate 20 yards down and opened it, his movements measured and deliberate. The puppies immediately ran to him, their relief palpable. They were thin, not starving, but clearly hadn't eaten properly in days. Their golden fur was the kind you saw on purebred labs, the kind of dogs that cost good money and belonged to families who loved them. "What is it, little ones?" Clay asked, his voice rusty from disuse. He'd been talking to himself and his animals for months now, but rarely with the expectation of any kind of response. These puppies, however, seemed to understand. They ran toward the ravine, stopped, and looked back to make sure he was following. When he took a step in their direction, they bounded ahead a few more yards and repeated the process. The ravine was deeper than it looked from horseback, carved by years of snowmelt and flash floods. Clay had ridden past it countless times, but had never had reason to explore it thoroughly. The puppies led him down a game trail that switched back toward the bottom, their small legs moving with surprising sure-footedness over the rocky terrain. Clay followed more slowly, his 61-year-old knees protesting the steep descent. Halfway down, he saw it. The rear bumper of a pickup truck, mostly hidden by brush and debris. Clay's pulse quickened as he scrambled down the remaining slope, the puppies dancing around his legs in excitement. The truck was a late-model Ford, silver under the dirt and scratches, lying on its side against the ravine wall like a discarded toy. Through the shattered passenger window, Clay could see movement. Human movement. These puppies hadn't been abandoned. They'd been survivors on a rescue mission, climbing out of this wreckage to find help for the people trapped inside. And somehow, in a valley where Clay rarely saw another soul for days at a time, they'd found the one man who might be able to save them all. Clay's hands shook as he pulled his cell phone from his shirt pocket, muscle memory overriding the shock that threatened to freeze him in place. 3 bars of service, barely enough, but it would have to do. The 911 operator's voice crackled through the speaker as Clay knelt beside the overturned truck, trying to get a better look at the occupants through the spider-webbed glass. "Wevan, what's your emergency?" "I've got a vehicle accident in the ravine off Lost Creek Road," Clay said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. 2 people trapped inside. "They're alive but hurt bad. I need paramedics and a rescue team. Sir, can you give me your exact location?" Clay rattled off the GPS coordinates he'd memorized for every section of his property, a habit left over from years of calling in veterinarians for sick cattle. The operator assured him help was on the way, but Clay knew it would take time. The ravine was accessible only on foot, and the nearest ambulance would have to come from Cedar Ridge, at least 20 minutes on a good day. Through the broken passenger window, Clay could see a young woman, maybe 25. Her dark hair matted with blood. She was conscious but groggy, blinking slowly as if trying to focus. Beside her, a young man about the same age was slumped against the driver's door, unconscious but breathing. The truck's cab was compressed, but intact enough that neither appeared to have suffered fatal injuries, though Clay could see the man's left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. "Hey there," Clay called softly to the woman. "Help's coming. You're going to be all right." Her eyes found his through the broken glass, wide with fear and confusion. "The dogs," she whispered. "Where are the dogs?" Clay glanced around to find both puppies sitting quietly beside him, as if they knew their job was done and were waiting for the next phase of their mission. "They're right here," he told her. "They're the ones who found you. Smart little heroes, these 2. The woman's face crumpled with relief, and tears began streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "We couldn't find them after the crash. We thought—" She stopped, overtaken by sobs that seemed to shake her whole body. "Shh, they're fine," Clay soothed, reaching carefully through the window to touch her shoulder. "What's your name, honey?" Sarah Morrison. "And that's my husband, Jake." Her voice was getting stronger, though Clay could see the pain she was fighting with every word. "We've been down here for 3 days. The storm came so fast, and the road just washed out from under us. 3 days. Clay felt his heart clench at the thought. 3 days of being trapped in this ravine while he rode past above, oblivious to their suffering. 3 days of these puppies somehow surviving and then mounting their desperate rescue mission. 3 days, that could have been 3 weeks, if not for 2 determined little dogs who refused to give up on the people they loved. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone, human and canine, look toward the rim of the ravine. Clay stood and waved his arms, shouting to guide the emergency responders to their location. Within minutes, paramedics were rappelling down with rescue equipment, transforming the quiet ravine into a scene of organized urgency. Clay stepped back to give them room to work, but found himself unable to leave. The 2 puppies seemed to feel the same way, staying close enough to watch, but far enough away not to interfere. They were remarkable animals, Clay realized, intelligent enough to know when their help was needed and disciplined enough to know when to step aside. "You the one who found them?" asked the lead paramedic, a woman about Clay's own age, with efficient movements and kind eyes. "The dogs found them," Clay corrected. "They came to my fence and led me down here." The paramedic glanced at the puppies with new respect. "Amazing. We've had search teams looking for these folks since Monday. The husband's got a broken arm and some internal injuries, but nothing life-threatening. The wife's got a concussion and she's dehydrated, but she's stable. They're lucky to be alive." Lucky. The word echoed in Clay's mind as he watched the rescue team carefully extract Jake and Sarah from the wreckage. When was the last time he'd thought of anything in terms of luck or blessing? These past months had been about endurance, about getting through each day without Margaret. But watching these young people being lifted to safety, seeing the joy in their eyes as they were reunited with their devoted dogs, Clay felt something stirring in his chest that he'd almost forgotten. Hope. The extraction took nearly 2 hours. Clay stayed the entire time, partly to help with the logistics and partly because he couldn't bring himself to leave. Sarah remained conscious throughout, constantly asking about the puppies and thanking Clay repeatedly for finding them. Jake regained consciousness as they stabilized him for transport, his first words echoing his wife's concern for their dogs. "They're heroes," Sarah told the paramedics. "Bella and Bandit, they saved our lives." Clay learned their story in fragments as the rescue progressed. Jake and Sarah Morrison were from Seattle, on their way to Jake's family reunion in Billings, when the flash flood hit. They were young marrieds, just 2 years into their life together, with everything ahead of them. The puppies were their first joint decision as a couple, adopted from a rescue organization 6 months ago. "We almost didn't bring them," Sarah confessed to Clay as the paramedics prepared to lift her up the ravine wall. "Jake's mom is allergic, but I couldn't stand the thought of leaving them in a kennel for a week." Thank God we didn't. As the ambulances finally pulled away, their red lights disappearing around the bend towards Cedar Ridge, Clay found himself alone in the ravine with Bella and Bandit. The puppies looked up at him expectantly, as if waiting for instructions. Their people were safe, but what happened now? Clay knelt down between them, studying their faces. They were beautiful dogs, purebreds with intelligent eyes and gentle temperaments. Under the dirt and exhaustion, he could see they'd been well cared for, loved members of a family who would want them back. But that family was now in the hospital, facing weeks of recovery and rehabilitation. These dogs needed somewhere to go, someone to care for them until their people were well enough to take them home. The logical thing would be to call the sheriff's department, let them handle the animals as part of the accident report. There were proper procedures for this kind of thing, official channels that ensured everything was done by the book. Clay had always been a man who followed proper procedures, who believed in letting the right people handle their designated responsibilities. But as he looked into Bella's golden eyes, he found himself remembering Margaret's voice from years ago. They'd found an injured hawk in their north pasture, wing broken by some predator or accident. Clay had wanted to call the wildlife office, let the professionals handle it. But Margaret had insisted they try to help it themselves first. "Sometimes," she'd said, wrapping the frightened bird in an old towel, "the right person for a job isn't the official person. Sometimes it's just the person who cares enough to try." They'd nursed that hawk back to health in their barn, feeding it mice that Clay caught in traps and giving it a safe place to heal. When it was strong enough, they'd released it back into the wild. Clay had never forgotten the feeling of watching it soar away, the satisfaction of knowing they'd made a difference in something's life, even something wild and untamed. These puppies weren't wild, but they were in need. And for the first time in months, Clay felt like he might be the right person to help. Not because it was his duty or his responsibility, but because something deep inside him was awakening, the part of himself that Margaret had always loved best, the part that cared for things smaller and weaker than himself. "Come on." "Then," he said to Bella and Bandit, standing and brushing the dirt off his knees, "let's go home." The walk back up the ravine was easier than the descent, though Clay had to stop several times to make sure the tired puppies could keep up. At the top, Ranger waited patiently, reins ground-tied exactly where Clay had left him. The old horse nickered softly when he saw the dogs, lowering his head to sniff them curiously. As they made their way back across the pasture, Clay found his mind racing ahead to practical concerns. Dog food, water bowls, somewhere for them to sleep. He'd need to call the hospital later, check on Jake and Sarah's condition, and let them know their dogs were safe. There would be veterinary bills to consider. The puppies looked healthy, but should be checked over after their ordeal. But underneath the practical planning, something else was happening. For the first time since Margaret's death, Clay was thinking beyond just getting through the day. He was planning, caring, feeling responsible for something other than his own grief. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As they reached the ranch house, both puppies looked up at the front porch as if they were seeing a palace. Their tails began to wag, the first truly carefree gesture Clay had seen from them. Maybe, he thought, they weren't the only ones who had been rescued today. The first full day with Bella and Bandit taught Clay more about himself than he'd learned in months. He discovered he was a worrier, constantly checking to make sure they had water, that they weren't getting into something dangerous, that they seemed content. He discovered he was out of practice with companionship. Talking to the dogs felt strange at first, but by evening he found himself narrating his activities as if they were old friends who'd been waiting all day to hear about his fence repairs and cattle checks. Most surprising of all, he discovered he was lonely in ways he hadn't acknowledged even to himself. The morning started early, as all ranch mornings did, but this time Clay wasn't alone in the kitchen. Both puppies had somehow migrated from their blankets in the living room to the hallway outside his bedroom door, where they waited patiently for him to wake up. Bella's tail began thumping the moment she heard his feet hit the floor, and Bandit stretched in that particular way puppies had of transforming from a small furry log into a wiggling bundle of energy. "Good morning to you, too," Clay found himself saying, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. When was the last time anyone had been happy to see him first thing in the morning? After letting them out into the fenced yard behind the house, Clay made coffee and watched through the kitchen window as the puppies explored their temporary domain. Bella was methodical, sniffing along the fence line and investigating every corner with scientific thoroughness. Bandit was more playful, chasing leaves and pouncing on shadows, occasionally bringing interesting sticks to show his sister. The sight of them playing in Margaret's old garden made Clay's throat tight. She'd spent countless hours out there, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn Montana soil and nursing her prized tomato plants through late spring frosts. After she died, Clay had let it go wild, unable to bear the thought of maintaining something so essentially hers. But watching the puppies frolic among the overgrown bean poles and fallen trellises, he wondered if Margaret would have wanted it to stay lifeless. She'd always said gardens were meant to be places of joy, The sound of a truck engine in the driveway interrupted his musings. Clay looked out the front window to see Betty Hartwell's ancient blue Ford pickup pulling up to the house. Betty was his closest neighbor in the relative sense. Her place was only 3 miles down the county road, but in ranch terms that made her practically next door. She was a woman of 70-something who'd been widowed about the same time Clay lost Margaret. Though she seemed to handle it with considerably more grace than he'd managed. "Clay Tanners," she called as she climbed out of her truck, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard across wide pastures. "I heard through the grapevine that you got yourself some new residents. News traveled fast in ranch country, especially news as unusual as Clay taking in stray dogs." Betty probably knew about the rescue before Clay had even finished talking to the hospital. She was carrying a paper grocery bag and wearing the determined expression. That usually meant she was about to involve herself in someone else's business, whether they wanted her to or not. "They're not strays," Clay said, stepping onto the porch. "They belong to the couple who got trapped in the ravine. I'm just keeping them until Jake and Sarah can take them back." Betty's eyes were already scanning the yard, taking in the sight of Bella and Bandit wrestling over a fallen apple from the old tree Margaret had planted their 2nd year of marriage. "And how long might that be?" "Few weeks, maybe. Depends on their recovery." Betty nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Well, I brought some supplies. Figured you might not have everything you need for temporary dog sitting." The grocery bag contained an impressive array of dog-related items: 2 proper food bowls, a bag of high-quality puppy food, a package of tennis balls, and a braided rope toy. At the bottom of the bag was a paperback book titled "The Complete Guide to Caring for Your New Puppy." "Betty, you didn't need to—" "Course I did. These aren't cattle, Clay. They need different things." She was already walking toward the yard, where the puppies had noticed her arrival and were approaching cautiously. "Besides, it's good to see some life around this place again." There it was, the comment Clay had been dreading. Everyone in the county had been treating him with kid gloves since Margaret died, tiptoeing around his grief and giving him space to heal in his own time. But Betty had never been one for tiptoeing. "They're beautiful animals," she continued, kneeling down to let Bella sniff her hand. "Labs, purebreds. Young couple from Seattle, Jake and Sarah Morrison, on their way to a family reunion when the flash flood hit. Long way to come for a family visit." Betty was scratching Bandit behind the ears now, and both puppies were warming up to her with typical lab friendliness. Must be important family. Clay found himself telling Betty the story he'd pieced together from his phone calls to the hospital and Jake's father. Jake Morrison worked for a tech company, some kind of software development that Clay didn't pretend to understand. Sarah was a teacher, 3rd grade, and they'd been married just over 2 years. The dogs were their first major decision as a married couple, adopted from a rescue organization that specialized in labs. "They sound like good people," Betty observed, standing and brushing dog hair off her hands. "The kind who raise dogs that risk their lives to save their family." "They are. Jake's parents are flying in from Seattle. Seems like a close family." Betty was quiet for a moment, watching the puppies chase each other around the old garden plot. "You know, Clay, I've been thinking about getting a dog myself." Company gets a little thin in the evenings, Clay understood. The evenings were the hardest part, when the work was done and the house settled into silence. During the day, a person could stay busy enough to avoid thinking too much. But evenings demanded a reckoning with solitude. "These two have been good company," he admitted. "Better than I expected." "Animals have a way of healing things," Betty said carefully. "Not replacing what's lost, mind you, but reminding us what it feels like to be needed." That afternoon, Clay took Betty's advice and called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinarian who'd been treating his ranch animals for 15 years. She agreed to make a house call to check over Bella and Bandit, partly as a professional courtesy and partly, Clay suspected, because she was curious about his unexpected venture into pet ownership. Dr. Walsh was a practical woman in her 40s who'd grown up on a ranch herself. She examined both puppies with efficient thoroughness, checking their teeth, eyes, and overall condition while they submitted to her attention with typical lab patience. "They're in remarkable shape considering their ordeal," she pronounced, giving Bandit a final pat. "Well socialized, good muscle tone, healthy coats. Someone's been taking excellent care of these dogs. Their people love them," Clay said. "You can see it in how the dogs behave. Confident, trusting. They know they're valued." Dr. Walsh nodded, packing her equipment back into her medical bag. "That makes all the difference with animals. Dogs especially. They become what their people believe they are." After she left, Clay found himself pondering that observation. What did his own animals think of him? His cattle were healthy and well cared for, but did they sense his emotional distance? Did Ranger feel the change in him since Margaret's death? The puppies, however, didn't seem to notice his emotional complications. They simply wanted to be near him, following him from room to room as he went about his evening routine. When he sat down to pay bills at the kitchen table, Bella settled herself across his feet while Bandit curled up nearby. Their presence was companionable without being demanding, comforting without being presumptuous. That night, Clay made a decision that surprised him. Instead of insisting the puppies stay on their blankets in the living room, he allowed them to follow him down the hallway toward his bedroom. He didn't invite them onto the bed. That felt like too much, too soon, but he didn't object when they arranged themselves on the braided rug beside his side of the bed. As he lay in the darkness, listening to their gentle breathing, Clay realized something had shifted. For the first time since Margaret's death, he wasn't dreading tomorrow. He was curious about it. What would Bella and Bandit think of his morning routine? Would they want to come along on his ride to check the cattle? How long before they felt completely at home here? The questions were simple ones, hardly life-changing. But they were about the future, about possibility, about something other than just enduring another day of loss. And that, Clay thought as sleep finally claimed him, was perhaps the most precious gift these two rescue dogs could have given him. The call came on a Thursday morning, while Clay was teaching Bella and Bandit to wait patiently while he saddled Ranger. It had taken 3 days of consistent training, but both puppies had finally learned that horses required careful, quiet approach, and that the reward for good behavior was getting to accompany him on his morning rounds. Mr. Tanner's, the voice was unfamiliar, younger than Robert Morrison's, with a slight southern accent. "This is Dr. Rebecca Martinez at Cedar Ridge Regional Hospital. I'm calling about Jake Morrison." Clay's stomach clenched. Complications. Something had gone wrong with the surgery, or an infection had set in, or... "How is he?" "He's stable, but there have been some developments I thought you should know about. Jake has been asking about his dogs constantly. It's actually becoming a problem for his recovery. He's supposed to be resting, but he gets agitated whenever he talks about Bella and Bandit. He's convinced something terrible has happened to them." Clay sank into one of the kitchen chairs, automatically reaching down to stroke Bella's head as she pressed against his leg. "I've been calling regular updates to his parents. The dogs are fine, better than fine. They're eating well, sleeping through the night, getting plenty of exercise. I know, and Mr. and Mrs. Morrison have passed along your reports. But Jake is having trouble processing information right now. The head trauma was more significant than we initially thought. He's experiencing some short-term memory issues and anxiety. He keeps asking the same questions about the accident, about whether the dogs survived." Clay closed his eyes, imagining the young man lying in that hospital bed, his mind trapped in the terror of those moments right after the crash, when he didn't know if his beloved dogs were alive or dead. "What do you need from me? Or would it be possible for you to bring the dogs for a visit? I know it's an unusual request, but sometimes seeing is the only way these patients can really believe. It might help both Jake and Sarah. She's been released, but she's staying at the hospital to be near her husband. She's not doing well either." The drive to Cedar Ridge usually took Clay 45 minutes, but with 2 anxious puppies in his truck, he made it in 35. Bella and Bandit seemed to sense they were going somewhere important, sitting alert and focused in the passenger seat, occasionally whimpering with what Clay had learned to recognize as their worried sound. The hospital parking lot felt foreign under the late afternoon sun. Clay hadn't been inside a hospital since Margaret's final days, and the antiseptic smell that hit him as soon as the automatic doors opened brought back memories he'd spent months trying to avoid. But Bella and Bandit pulled him forward with their eager anticipation, their tails wagging as they somehow understood they were close to their people. Dr. Martinez met them at the information desk. A petite woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "You must be Clay, and these must be our heroes." Both dogs immediately went to her, sensing her calm authority. She knelt down to greet them properly, letting them sniff her hands and speaking to them in the gentle voice medical professionals reserved for their most vulnerable patients. "They're beautiful animals," she said, standing. "I can see why Jake and Sarah are so attached. Let me take you up to the room, but I should warn you, Jake may not remember meeting you the first time. His short-term memory is still fragmented." They rode the elevator in silence, Clay's heart pounding harder with each floor they climbed. He'd spoken to Jake's parents several times, but hadn't seen the young couple since that day in the ravine. What if they were worse than he'd been told? What if seeing them brought back all the helplessness he'd felt watching Margaret fade away in a room just like the ones they were passing? Room 314 was at the end of a long hallway that smelled of floor wax and industrial detergent. Through the partially open door, Clay could hear quiet voices, Jake's parents, he guessed, trying to reassure their son about something. Dr. Martinez knocked gently and pushed the door open. "Jake? Sarah, I've brought some visitors." The moment Bella and Bandit saw their people, they transformed. Gone was the calm, well-behaved demeanor they'd maintained throughout the drive. Both dogs strained against their leashes, whimpering and crying with pure joy. Sarah, who'd been sitting in a chair beside Jake's bed, immediately dropped to her knees on the floor. "Bella!" "Bandit, oh my babies, you're really okay." Jake struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, his face lighting up with an expression of profound relief. His left arm was in a cast from shoulder to wrist, and there was a bandage covering part of his head. But his eyes were clear as he watched his dog's lavish attention on his wife. "They made it," he whispered, and Clay heard years of worry compressed into those two words. "I kept having dreams that they didn't make it out of the truck." Clay stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder on this intensely private moment of reunion. Robert and Linda Morrison rose from their chairs near the window, both of them emotional as they watched their son's face transform from anxiety to peace. "Jake," Sarah said, struggling to speak through her tears as both dogs tried to climb into her lap at once. "This is Mr. Tanner's. He's the one who's been taking care of Bella and Bandit." Jake looked at Clay with an expression of such profound gratitude that Clay had to look away. "You found us. The nurse said the dogs led you to the ravine." "They're remarkable animals," Clay said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Smart and determined. They knew exactly what they were doing when they came to my fence." "They've always been special," Jake said, reaching his good hand toward Bandit, who immediately moved to the bedside so Jake could pet him. "We got them from a rescue that specializes in labs from puppy mill situations. The woman there said they'd been through trauma before we adopted them, that they understand what it means to be saved." Clay felt something twist in his chest. These dogs had been rescued once before, had known abandonment and fear before Jake and Sarah gave them a secure home. No wonder they'd been so determined to save their people. They understood the precious nature of being loved and cared for. The visit lasted an hour, with Jake's anxiety visibly decreasing as he was able to touch his dogs and see for himself that they were healthy and happy. Sarah cried through most of it, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. Clay found himself answering detailed questions about the dogs' routine, what they liked to eat, where they slept, how they spent their days. "They sleep in my room," he admitted when Sarah asked. "Not on the bed, but nearby. They seem to like the company." "They've never liked being alone," Sarah said, stroking Bella's golden head. "Even when we're just at work, they wait by the door until we come home." As visiting hours came to an end, Clay could see the anxiety beginning to creep back into Jake's expression. The young man was clearly dreading saying goodbye to his dogs again, afraid this might be another dream or that he wouldn't remember the visit in the morning. "I'll bring them back," Clay heard himself promising. "Next week when you're feeling stronger. And I'll call every day with updates about how they're doing." Jake nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you. I know they're in good hands, but they're your family," Clay finished. "I understand." Walking back through the hospital corridors, Clay realized he did understand more than he'd expected to. The fierce love Jake and Sarah had for their dogs. The desperate need to know they were safe and cared for. The way animals could become the center of everything that mattered. Clay remembered feeling that way about Margaret, about the life they'd built together. The difference was that Jake and Sarah still had hope. Their story was about recovery and reunion, not loss and letting go. And maybe, Clay thought as he loaded the tired puppies back into his truck, that was something he needed to remember about his own story too. 2 weeks into what was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, Clay caught himself doing something he hadn't done in months, laughing out loud. Bandit had somehow managed to get his head stuck in an empty coffee can while investigating the recycling bin. And his muffled barks of indignation, combined with his stumbling attempts to free himself, struck Clay as the most ridiculous thing he'd seen in years. "Hold still, you knucklehead," Clay chuckled, carefully working the can free while Bella watched with what looked suspiciously like amusement. "What did you think was going to happen?" Bandit shook his head vigorously once freed, then immediately returned to investigate the recycling bin as if nothing had happened. Clay found himself grinning as he watched the puppy's fearless curiosity. When was the last time he'd found anything funny enough to laugh about? The realization sobered him. He was getting too attached. These weren't his dogs, no matter how seamlessly they'd integrated themselves into his daily routine. No matter how Bella had claimed the spot at his feet during morning coffee, or how Bandit had taken to bringing him interesting sticks and rocks as if they were precious gifts. No matter how much more alive the ranch felt with their presence, Jake was improving steadily, according to the daily reports Clay received from Robert Morrison. The memory issues were resolving, and the physical injuries were healing ahead of schedule. Sarah had been cleared to return to work, but was taking extended leave to care for her husband. They'd moved temporarily into Jake's parents' guest room in Seattle while he completed his recovery, but both were eager to return to their normal life as soon as possible. Their normal life, which included taking Bella and Bandit home. Clay tried to imagine the ranch without them and found he couldn't. In just 2 weeks, they'd become part of everything he did. They rode with him to check cattle, Bella trotting alongside Ranger, while Bandit preferred to ride in the saddlebags Clay had modified for the purpose. They helped with evening chores, their presence making even mundane tasks feel companionable. They'd made friends with the barn cats and reached a peaceful understanding with the chickens Margaret had insisted on keeping. Most importantly, they'd made the house feel like a home again instead of a museum of memories. The phone rang while Clay was splitting wood for the coming winter. Both dogs sprawled in the afternoon sunshine, watching him work. He recognized Sarah's voice immediately, stronger and more animated than it had been during their hospital visit. "Mr. Tanners, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all. How are you feeling? And how's Jake?" "Much better, both of us. The doctors say Jake can travel next week. We're planning to fly back to Montana to get Bella and Bandit, and to thank you properly for everything you've done." Clay felt his chest tighten. Next week, of course, they were ready to take their dogs home. It was what he'd been expecting, what he'd known would happen from the beginning. So why did it feel like someone was squeezing his heart? "That's wonderful news," he managed. "They'll be excited to see you. I wanted to ask you about their routine," Sarah continued. "I know they've been with you for 2 weeks now, and I don't want the transition home to be too jarring for them. Could you tell me about their daily schedule? What they like to eat, where they sleep, that sort of thing?" As Clay described the puppy's life on the ranch, he realized how completely they'd adapted to his world. They woke with the sunrise and helped with morning chores. They spent their days exploring the property, learning the boundaries of their temporary territory. They ate twice a day at the kitchen table where Clay could keep an eye on them, They slept on the braided rug beside his bed, their breathing a comfort he'd grown to depend on. "They sound so happy," Sarah said when he finished. "I was worried they might be pining for us or having trouble adjusting to ranch life." "They're adaptable animals," Clay said carefully. "They seem to make the best of whatever situation they're in." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Tanners, can I ask you something? Has taking care of Bella and Bandit been a burden for you? I know you live alone, and we kind of dropped this responsibility on you without much warning." Clay looked out the kitchen window, where both puppies were now investigating something fascinating near the old garden plot. "Burden? They'd been many things, surprising, challenging, occasionally frustrating when they got into mischief, but never a burden. They've been good company," he said honestly. "Better than I expected." "Good, because Jake and I have been talking and we have a proposition for you. We know you've grown attached to them, and honestly, they're going to miss ranch life when we take them back to our apartment in Seattle. What would you think about us visiting regularly? Maybe even spending summers here if we could work something out?" Clay felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying for days. "You'd be welcome any time. Both of you and the dogs." That evening, as Clay worked on repair projects in the barn, he found his mind wandering to memories of Margaret. Not the painful ones that had haunted him for months, but earlier ones, happier times when their dreams had been bigger than their reality. They'd talked about having children who would grow up on the ranch, learning to ride and take care of animals. They'd imagined grandchildren visiting during summer vacations, filling the house with laughter and chaos. It had never happened. The children they'd hoped for remained an ache in their hearts that never quite healed, though they'd learned to carry it gracefully. They'd focused their nurturing instincts on each other and their animals, building a life that was complete, even if it wasn't exactly what they'd originally planned. Bella appeared at his elbow, resting her chin on his workbench and watching as he tightened a loose hinge on a gate. Her eyes were intelligent and patient, as if she understood that humans sometimes needed quiet company while they worked through complex emotions. "What do you think, girl?" Clay asked, pausing to scratch behind her ears. "Think your people would really come back to visit?" Bella's tail wagged once, a measured response that suggested she had opinions about the matter, but was too polite to express them definitively. The truth was, Clay realized it didn't matter whether Jake and Sarah kept their promise about visits. What mattered was that for 2 weeks he'd remembered what it felt like to care for something beyond himself. He'd remembered the satisfaction of being needed, of having a purpose that extended beyond just maintaining what already existed. The ranch operation would continue whether or not he had dogs underfoot. The cattle would still need tending. The horses would still need riding. The endless maintenance tasks would still demand his attention. But Bella and Bandit had reminded him that a ranch was more than a business. It was a place where life happened, where relationships grew, where love took root and flourished. That night, as he lay listening to the familiar sound of their breathing from the rug beside his bed, Clay made a decision. When Jake and Sarah came to take their dogs home, he would tell them about the puppy mills that still operated in Montana, about the rescue organizations that always needed foster homes for animals in transition. He would ask them to help him find dogs who needed the kind of temporary sanctuary his ranch could provide. Not replacements for Bella and Bandit, no dog could be that, but companions for the future, animals who could benefit from what Clay was finally ready to admit he had plenty to give. Space, time, patience, and a heart that was bigger than his grief. Margaret would have understood. She'd always said that love multiplied when it was shared, that the best way to honor what you'd lost was to remain open to what might still be found. As sleep finally claimed him, Clay thought he could almost hear her voice in the prairie wind outside his window, telling him what she'd told him 43 years ago when they'd first talked about filling this house with life. There's always room for more love. Clay, always. The call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days before Jake and Sarah were scheduled to fly back to Montana. Clay had been awake for an hour, as was his custom, but he hadn't yet gotten out of bed when the phone rang. Bella and Bandit lifted their heads from their spots on the rug, alert to the unusual timing of the call. Mr. Tanner's? The voice was Linda Morrison, Jake's mother, but something in her tone made Clay's stomach clench. "I'm sorry to call so early, but something's happened." Clay sat up straighter, already reaching for his clothes. "What is it? Is Jake all right?" "There's been a complication." "Not with Jake, he's healing beautifully." "It's—" Linda paused, and Clay could hear her taking a shaky breath. "It's about Sarah. She collapsed yesterday evening. They've run tests all night, and they found— oh, Clay, they found a brain tumor." The words hit Clay like a physical blow. Brain tumor. Sarah, with her quick smile and fierce love for her dogs. Sarah, who was supposed to be recovering from a simple concussion. Sarah, who was planning to come home next week. "What kind of tumor?" Clay asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "The doctors think it's been there for months, maybe longer. The accident didn't cause it. They think the impact from the crash actually revealed it. If they hadn't gotten a CT scan after the accident, they might not have found it until—" Linda's voice broke. "Until it was too late." Clay closed his eyes, pieces of a puzzle suddenly falling into place in ways he didn't want them to fit. The memory issues Jake was having, were they really from his head injury? That's what we all thought. But now, the doctors are wondering if some of what we attributed to Jake's trauma might have been early symptoms from Sarah's condition. She was the one driving when they crashed, Clay. She doesn't remember much, but Jake remembers her saying she felt dizzy, that something was wrong right before the road washed out. The implications settled over Clay like a heavy blanket. The flash flood had been random, unavoidable. But what if Sarah's tumor had been affecting her judgment, her reaction time? What if the crash hadn't been entirely due to circumstances beyond their control? "What's the prognosis?" Clay asked quietly. "They're going to operate next week. It's complicated surgery, and there are no guarantees. She could lose some cognitive function or—" Linda stopped, unable to voice the alternative. Clay understood. After watching Margaret slip away bit by bit, he understood all too well what Linda couldn't bring herself to say. "What does this mean for Bella and Bandit?" Clay asked, hating himself for the practical question but knowing it needed to be asked. "That's why I'm calling. Jake and I had a long talk last night. He's not in any shape to take care of the dogs by himself, especially if Sarah needs extensive care. His arm is still healing, and he's going to need to be at the hospital constantly. We're going to have to ask you to keep them longer. Maybe—" Linda's voice wavered. "Maybe much longer." After Clay hung up, he sat on the edge of his bed with both puppies pressed against his legs, absorbing the news. Sarah Morrison, a 26-year-old woman who should have had decades ahead of her, was facing the same kind of battle that had ultimately claimed Margaret. The unfairness of it made Clay's chest ache with familiar rage. Against a universe that seemed to take the wrong people too soon, but underneath the sadness was something else. Something Clay was ashamed to acknowledge even to himself. Relief. Bella. And Bandit wouldn't be leaving. The routine he'd grown to cherish, the companionship he'd come to depend on, the purpose that had returned to his days. None of it had to end next week. The shame of that relief consumed him for the rest of the morning. What kind of man found a silver lining in a young woman's life-threatening illness? What kind of person felt grateful for circumstances that kept someone else's beloved pets away from them during a medical crisis? He tried to distract himself with ranch work, but his heart wasn't in it. The cattle seemed to sense his mood and gave him a wide berth. Even Ranger picked up on Clay's distress, walking with unusual care, as if he understood his rider was carrying an invisible burden. It was Betty Hartwell who finally forced Clay to confront his complicated emotions. She appeared at his door around noon, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the expression that meant she was prepared to meddle in his business, whether he liked it or not. "Heard about Sarah Morrison?" she said without preamble, setting the dish on his kitchen counter. "Terrible news! That poor young woman." Clay nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I suppose this means you'll be keeping the dogs longer than expected." "Looks that way." Betty studied his face with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried one husband. "You're feeling guilty about something?" It wasn't a question, so Clay didn't bother denying it. I should be thinking about that girl and what she's facing. Instead, He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Instead, you're relieved that the dogs won't be leaving. Betty finished for him. And you think that makes you a terrible person? Clay looked away, but Betty stepped into his line of sight, forcing him to meet her eyes. Clay Tanners, I've known you for 15 years, and you're one of the most decent men I've ever met. The fact that you found happiness again after losing Margaret isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be grateful for. But Sarah Morrison is fighting for her life, and that's tragic. But her fight doesn't diminish your right to find joy where you can. Those dogs need care, and you're able to give it. That's not selfish. That's exactly what they need right now. That afternoon, Clay made a decision that surprised him. He drove to Cedar Ridge and spent an hour at the hospital with Jake Morrison, sitting quietly while the young man talked through his fears about his wife's condition. Jake was trying to be strong, but Clay could see the cracks in his composure, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. I keep thinking about the accident, Jake confessed. If I'd been driving, would things be different? If we'd left an hour earlier or later, would the road have been washed out? If I'd insisted she see a doctor weeks ago when she started getting headaches, the what-ifs will eat you alive, Clay said quietly. I know because I've been there. When Margaret was sick, I tortured myself with every decision I'd made, every sign I might have missed. But guilt doesn't change anything that's already happened, and it doesn't help the person you're trying to take care of. Jake looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. How do you bear it? The waiting, not knowing, one day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time. And you focus on what you can control instead of what you can't. I can't even take care of our dogs right now, Jake said, his voice breaking. Sarah loves those dogs so much, and I can't even— Your dogs are fine, Clay interrupted gently. They're safe, they're loved, and they're being cared for. That's one thing you don't have to worry about. Focus on Sarah and on getting yourself healed. Everything else can wait. On the drive home, Clay realized something had shifted in his perspective. The guilt was still there, but it was manageable now. Betty had been right. His growing attachment to Bella and Bandit didn't diminish the tragedy of Sarah's illness. If anything, his ability to care for the dogs during this crisis was a gift he could offer to a young couple facing the greatest challenge of their lives. That evening, as Clay sat on his porch watching the dogs explore their evening territory, he thought about the strange web of circumstances that had brought them all together. A flash flood, a rescue mission by 2 devoted animals, and now a medical crisis that none of them could have anticipated. Margaret used to say that life was like quilting, individual pieces that seemed random and unconnected, but which formed a meaningful pattern when you stepped back far enough to see the whole design. Maybe she would have seen a pattern in all of this. Maybe she would have understood that sometimes the most important gifts came wrapped in the most difficult circumstances. Bella trotted up to the porch and settled beside Clay's chair, resting her head against his knee. In the fading light, her golden coat caught the last rays of sunshine, and her eyes held the patient wisdom that all good dogs seem to possess. We're going to take care of each other, Clay told her quietly. For as long as it takes. However long that might be. Bella's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a sound that felt like agreement, like promise, like hope. The morning of Sarah's surgery dawned grey and cold, with the kind of autumn wind that reminded everyone in Montana that winter was never far away. Clay had been awake since 3, unable to sleep through the storm of emotions churning in his chest. In 12 hours, Sarah Morrison would be under the surgeon's knife, fighting for a future that might or might not include the life she'd planned with Jake and their beloved dogs. Clay stood at his kitchen window, watching Bella and Bandit play in the yard as if this were any ordinary day. Their resilience amazed him, their ability to live fully in each moment without being weighed down by the uncertainty that consumed the humans around them. Maybe that was what he needed to learn from them, how to be present in the now instead of constantly worrying about what tomorrow might bring. The phone rang at 7:30. Clay recognized Robert Morrison's voice immediately, though it sounded strained and tired. "Clay, I wanted to call before we head to the hospital. Sarah asked me to thank you again for everything you're doing. She wanted you to know that knowing Bella and Bandit are safe and happy is giving her strength for today. How is she feeling?" Clay asked. "Scared, brave. You know how it is." Robert's voice caught slightly. "She made Jake promise that if something goes wrong today, the dog should stay with you permanently. She doesn't want them to end up in a shelter or with strangers." Clay felt his throat tighten. The thought of Sarah facing surgery that could change her life forever, worrying about her dog's welfare, was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. It spoke to the depth of her love for Bella and Bandit, and to the trust she'd somehow developed in a man she'd met only once. "That won't be necessary," Clay said firmly. "Sarah's going to be fine, and when she is, these dogs will be waiting for her." But as he hung up the phone, Clay realized he was making a promise he had no power to keep. Surgery was surgery, especially brain surgery. He'd learned that lesson too well with Margaret, whose doctors had been optimistic right up until the moment they weren't. The waiting was the hardest part. Clay tried to keep busy with ranch work, but his mind kept drifting to the hospital in Seattle, where a team of surgeons was working to save a young woman's life. He found himself checking the clock constantly, calculating how long the surgery had been going, how much longer it might take, what the silence might mean. Betty Hartwell appeared at his door around noon, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression that meant she was prepared to sit with him through whatever came next. "Figured you might need some company today," she said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs without waiting for an invitation. Days like this, a person shouldn't be alone with their thoughts. Clay was grateful for her presence, though neither of them spoke much. Sometimes companionship was less about conversation and more about simply not being solitary with your fears. Betty understood that. Having waited through her own share of medical crises over the years, the dogs seemed to sense the tension in the house. Bella stayed close to Clay's side, occasionally resting her head against his leg as if offering comfort. Bandit was more restless, moving from room to room and whimpering softly at windows, as if he was looking for someone who wasn't there. Around 3 o'clock, Clay made a decision that surprised him. He called Dr. Jennifer Walsh and asked her to make a house call to examine both dogs thoroughly, not because he thought anything was wrong with them, but because he wanted to make sure they were in perfect health for whatever came next. "That's unusual," Dr. Walsh observed as she examined Bandit's ears. "They were both healthy when I saw them 2 weeks ago. Has something changed?" Clay found himself explaining about Sarah's surgery, about the uncertainty surrounding the dog's future, about his growing sense that he needed to be prepared for any outcome. "You're planning ahead," Dr. Walsh said, understanding immediately. "Making sure you can give Jake and Sarah good news about their dog's health, regardless of what else they're dealing with." Something like that. Dr. Walsh finished her examination and packed her equipment thoughtfully. "Clay, can I ask you something? What are you going to do if Sarah doesn't make it through this?" The question hit Clay like a physical blow, partly because it forced him to confront the possibility he'd been trying not to think about, and partly because it highlighted a decision he'd been avoiding. "I don't know," he admitted. "Jake says he can't take care of them by himself, at least not for a while. His parents are allergic. I suppose I'd keep them until what? Until you find someone else to take them. Clay, those dogs have been here for over a month now. They've bonded with you with this place. Maybe the question isn't what you'll do temporarily, but what you want to do permanently." After Dr. Walsh left, Clay found himself walking through his house with different eyes, seeing it as Bella and Bandit might see it. The living room, where they'd claimed spots near the fireplace. The kitchen, where they waited patiently for their meals. The bedroom, where they'd taken up residence on the rug beside his bed, their breathing a comfort he'd grown to depend on. When was the last time this house had felt so alive? When was the last time he'd looked forward to coming inside after a day's work, knowing companions waited for him? When was the last time he'd felt needed in ways that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love? The call came at 6:15, just as Clay was feeding the dogs their evening meal. Robert Morrison's voice was thick with exhaustion and relief. She made it through surgery. The doctor says they were able to remove most of the tumor, and they don't think it was malignant. She's not awake yet, but her vital signs are strong. Clay sank into a kitchen chair, feeling weeks of tension drain from his shoulders. Thank God. How's Jake holding up? Better now. It's going to be a long recovery. Weeks in the hospital, months of rehabilitation. The doctors aren't sure yet what kind of cognitive effects she might have, but they're optimistic about her chances for a full recovery. Months of rehabilitation. Clay absorbed this information while watching. Bella and Bandit eat their dinner with the focused attention that suggested they found his emotional state more interesting than their food. What does this mean for the dogs? Clay asked. Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Jake and I discussed this while we were waiting for news. Even with the surgery being successful, Sarah's going to need extensive care. Jake's not physically capable of taking care of both Sarah and the dogs. And we can't have them at our house because of Linda's allergies. Clay waited, sensing there was more. We'd like to ask you to keep Bella and Bandit until Sarah is fully recovered. We know it's a lot to ask, and we'll pay for everything, of course. But Jake says you've grown attached to them, and honestly, he thinks they might be happier on the ranch than cooped up in a Seattle apartment while everyone's focused on Sarah's recovery. Keep them until Sarah was fully recovered. That could be months, maybe longer. Clay looked at the two dogs, who had somehow become central to his daily routine, who had reminded him what it felt like to care for something beyond himself, who had brought laughter and purpose back into a house that had been too quiet for too long. I think that would work out fine, Clay said, surprised by how calm his voice sounded when his heart was pounding with something that felt remarkably like joy. That evening, as Clay sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, he found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a man going through the motions of living, maintaining his property and his routines, but not really engaging with life. Now he was responsible for 2 dogs who needed him, connected to a young couple fighting to rebuild their life together. Part of a story that was still being written. The future was uncertain. Sarah's recovery would be long and difficult, and there were no guarantees about what kind of life she'd be able to return to. But uncertainty, Clay was learning, wasn't the same thing as hopelessness. Bella appeared at his side, settling into the spot she'd claimed as her own beside his chair. Bandit was investigating something fascinating near the old garden plot. But he kept one eye on the porch to make sure his people were still where he'd left them. We're going to be all right, Clay told Bella quietly, stroking her soft golden head. All of us, in whatever ways we can manage. As the last light faded from the sky, Clay realized he was making plans again, not just for tomorrow's chores or next week's cattle sales, but for the future. He was thinking about expanding the fenced area behind the house to give the dogs more room to run. He was considering building a proper doghouse for the times when they wanted to be outside in bad weather. He was even thinking about calling the rescue organization, where Jake and Sarah had found Bella and Bandit, to see if they needed foster homes for other dogs in transition. For the first time since Margaret's death, Clay Tanners was thinking about growth instead of just maintenance, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. 3 days after Sarah's surgery, Clay found himself standing in Margaret's sewing room for the first time since her death. Bella had followed him there, drawn by his unusually aimless wandering through the house, and now sat patiently by the door, as if she understood she was witnessing something important. The room was exactly as Margaret had left it. Her sewing machine still held the half-finished curtains she'd been making for the guest bedroom, cheerful yellow fabric with tiny blue flowers that she'd said reminded her of spring meadows. Spools of thread were arranged by color in the wooden organizer Clay had made for her 10th wedding anniversary. Pattern pieces were still pinned to the cutting table, waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. Clay had avoided this room because it hurt too much to see Margaret's projects interrupted mid-thought, her creative energy frozen in time. But today, looking at the sunny fabric and the carefully organized supplies, he felt something different than the usual stab of grief. He felt curiosity about what she'd been planning, appreciation for the care she'd put into her work, gratitude for the years he'd been able to watch her transform simple fabric into beautiful, useful things. She was going to make dog beds, he said aloud, surprising himself. Bella's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and she moved closer to investigate what had captured his attention. The pattern pieces pinned to the table weren't for curtains at all, Clay realized as he looked more carefully. They were for pet beds, 2 of them sized for large dogs. Margaret had been planning to make beds for dogs they didn't have, dreaming of companions that had never materialized. Clay sank into Margaret's desk chair, the weight of discovery settling over him. All those years when they'd talked about getting a dog, Margaret had been secretly planning for it, preparing for the day when their house would finally have the 4-legged family members they'd both wanted, but never quite gotten around to adopting. She'd bought the fabric and cut the pattern pieces, ready to surprise him when the right dogs came along. The right dogs had come along just 43 years later than Margaret had anticipated. Clay picked up one of the pattern pieces, studying Margaret's careful pencil marks and measurement notations. Her handwriting was there in the margins. Extra padding for comfort, and washable cover, blue thread. She'd thought through every detail, imagining dogs she'd never met, but already loved enough to plan for their comfort. She knew, Clay whispered to Bella, who had settled beside his chair with the patient attention that suggested she was prepared to stay as long as needed. Somehow, she knew. For the first time since Margaret's death, Clay allowed himself to really remember her. Not just the final months of illness and loss, but the vibrant woman who'd shared his life and dreams for nearly 4 decades. Margaret, who'd insisted on keeping chickens, even though they were more trouble than they were worth, because she loved their silly personalities and the fresh eggs they provided. Margaret, who'd hand-stitched quilts for every new baby born to their neighbors, even though she'd never had babies of her own to sew for. Margaret, who'd saved fabric scraps for years, dreaming of dogs who would need comfortable beds. The tears came then, not the bitter tears of early grief, but something gentler. Tears of gratitude for the love they'd shared, for the dreams they'd held together, for the woman who'd been planning surprises for him even in the last months of her life. When the tears stopped, Clay felt something he hadn't experienced in almost a year: peace. Not the absence of sadness, but the presence of something larger than sadness. Understanding, maybe, or acceptance. Margaret was gone, but her love wasn't. Her dreams weren't. Her capacity for planning happiness was still there, in the yellow fabric with blue flowers, still there in the carefully measured pattern pieces, still there in his own growing ability to care for Bella and Bandit. Clay stood and gathered the pattern pieces, smoothing them carefully as Margaret would have done. He'd never used a sewing machine in his life, but Betty Hartwell had. She'd taught her daughters to sew, and she'd probably be willing to teach a stubborn rancher how to follow his late wife's pattern. "What do you think, Bella?" he asked, holding up the fabric so she could see it. "Think Margaret would approve of us finishing her project?" Bella's tail thumped against the floor, a sound Clay chose to interpret as enthusiastic approval. That afternoon, Clay loaded the fabric, pattern pieces, and Margaret's detailed notes into his truck and drove to Betty's house. She met him at the door with knowing eyes and a smile that suggested she'd been expecting this visit. "Finally ready to go through Margaret's things?" she asked gently. "Not all of them, but I found something she was making. Dog beds, for Bella and Bandit." Betty's eyes brightened with understanding. Of course she was. Margaret always could see around corners, could see what was coming before the rest of us caught on. They spent the rest of the afternoon in Betty's sewing room, with Clay operating the sewing machine under Betty's patient instruction, while she cut fabric and managed the more delicate operations. It was frustrating work at first. Clay's large, weathered hands weren't designed for precision stitching, and he broke 3 needles before he got the hang of controlling the machine's speed. But as the first dog bed took shape, Clay found himself thinking about Margaret's hands guiding the same kind of machine, creating useful beauty from raw materials. There was something deeply satisfying about completing her vision, about bringing her final gift for dogs she'd never met into physical reality. "She'd be proud of you," Betty said as they finished the binding on the second bed, "both for this and for everything else. Margaret always said you had more love to give than you realized." As the sun set, Clay loaded the finished dog beds into his truck and headed home. Bella and Bandit were waiting on the porch as if they'd somehow known this was an important day, and that their patient presence would be needed when he returned. Clay carried the beds inside and placed them in the living room near the fireplace, the same spot where the dogs had been sleeping on old blankets for weeks. Both dogs immediately investigated their new accommodations, sniffing the fresh fabric and testing the softness with careful paws. Bella was the first to claim her bed, circling twice before settling into the yellow fabric with a contented sigh. Bandit followed her lead, curling up on his own bed with the satisfied air of a dog who'd finally found exactly where he belonged. Clay stood watching them, struck by how right this felt, Margaret's last gift being enjoyed by the dogs, who'd somehow found their way to the ranch she'd loved, filling the house with the companionship she'd always dreamed of providing. For the first time since her death, Clay felt Margaret's presence not as an absence, but as a continuation. Her love was still active in the world, still creating comfort and joy, still connecting him to the future, instead of trapping him in the past. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Sarah's surgery. Clay was repairing a fence gate while Bella and Bandit supervised from the shade of a cottonwood tree. Both dogs sprawled contentedly on their new beds, which had become portable furniture that followed Clay wherever his work took him. "Mr. Tanner's?" The voice was stronger than Clay had heard it since the hospital, though still soft with the careful modulation of someone recovering from major surgery. "This is Sarah Morrison." Clay straightened, dropping his tools. "Sarah, how are you feeling?" "Better every day. The doctors are amazed by my progress." There was genuine joy in her voice, the sound of someone who'd stared mortality in the face and lived to tell about it. "I wanted to call you myself to say thank you. Jake told me about the dog beds you made, about how well you've been caring for Bella and Bandit. I can't tell you what it means to know they're so loved." "Your wife had the pattern cut out," Clay found himself saying. "The fabric was already chosen. I just followed her instructions. She sounds like she was a special woman." "She was." Clay paused, watching Bella lift her head to look at him with those intelligent eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. These dogs, they've become family to me. I know they belong with you and Jake, and I'll respect whatever decision you make about their future. But I want you to know that if you ever need someone to care for them, for any reason, they'll always have a home here." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "That means everything, Mr. Tanners, more than you know. How much longer do the doctors think your recovery will take?" "At least 3 more months of intensive rehabilitation, maybe longer. And even when I'm cleared to go home, I'll need to take things slowly. Jake's been incredible, but he's still healing too. We've been talking about what's best for everyone." Clay felt his heart rate pick up, though he tried to keep his voice neutral. "What have you decided?" "We want Bella and Bandit to stay with you permanently." The words hit Clay like a lightning bolt, unexpected despite weeks of hoping for exactly this outcome. "Sarah, are you sure? These are your dogs, your family." "They were our family," Sarah interrupted gently. "Now they're yours. Jake and I have talked about this endlessly. We love those dogs more than words can express. But love sometimes means wanting what's best for the ones you love, even if it's not what you originally planned." Clay sank onto a nearby fence post, his legs suddenly unsteady. Bella must have sensed something significant was happening, because she got up from her bed and came to stand beside him, leaning her warm weight against his leg. "We've seen how they've thrived with you," Sarah continued. "Jake visited his parents last week, his first trip out of the hospital, and all he could talk about was how happy and healthy the dogs looked in the pictures you've been sending. They have space to run, meaningful work to do, someone who understands them. We're city people, Mr. Tanners. Our apartment doesn't have a yard, and with my health issues, we might not be able to give them the active life they deserve. But you love them, Clay protested, even as part of him was rejoicing at the possibility of keeping Bella and Bandit forever. We do love them. That's exactly why we want them to stay with you. Love isn't about possession. It's about wanting the best life possible for those you care about. Clay thought about Margaret, about how she'd faced her illness with grace, partly because she trusted him to find ways to be happy after she was gone. Sarah Morrison, at 26, had learned the same hard lesson about love that had taken Clay 61 years to fully understand. There is one condition, Sarah added, and Clay heard a smile in her voice. We want to visit. Not right away, but someday when I'm stronger. We want to see the ranch, meet the horses, watch Bella and Bandit in their new life. If that's all right with you. More than all right, Clay said, his voice rough with emotion. You'll always be welcome here. Both of you? After the call ended, Clay sat in the morning sunshine with both dogs pressed against him, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Bella and Bandit were his now. Not temporary guests, not foster animals, but permanent family members who would grow old on this ranch, who would share his daily routines and his quiet evenings, who would keep him company through whatever years remained to him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 43 years of marriage hoping for children who never came, and now in his widowhood he'd been given the companionship he and Margaret had always dreamed of. Not in the form they'd expected, but in a form that felt perfectly right for the life he was building now. That afternoon, Clay called the rescue organization where Jake and Sarah had found Bella and Bandit. The woman who answered, Linda Chen, according to her business card, listened with interest as Clay explained his situation and his growing interest in fostering other dogs in need. We always need experienced foster homes, Linda said enthusiastically, especially for the older dogs and the ones with special needs. Dogs who've been traumatized or who need medical care or who just need time to learn to trust again. I think I'd like that, Clay said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. I've got space, time, and it turns out I'm better at this than I thought I'd be. As the sun set that evening, Clay sat on his porch with Bella and Bandit flanking his chair like a pair of golden bookends. The ranch stretched out before them in the gathering darkness, peaceful and productive and alive with possibility. Tomorrow, he would call a contractor about expanding the fenced area behind the house. Next week, he would drive to town and buy proper dog supplies, bowls and toys and grooming equipment that would be permanent additions to his household. But tonight, he simply sat and appreciated the weight of Bella's head against his knee, the sound of Bandit's contented sighing, the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, caring for exactly who he was meant to care for. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze, There's always room for more love. Clay, always. 6 months later, Clay Tanners still rose before dawn, but the habit no longer felt like a burden. The old brass alarm clock still chimed at 5:15 each morning. But now, Clay was often awakened earlier by the gentle sounds of Bella and Bandit stirring on their beds, not demanding attention, but simply ready to begin another day alongside the man who'd become their person. The morning routine had evolved to accommodate his companions. Coffee first, always, but now Clay shared the quiet kitchen with 2 dogs who'd learned to wait patiently while he gathered himself for the day. Then outside to the fenced yard, Clay had expanded to encompass nearly an acre, where Bella could pursue her methodical inspection of the property while Bandit chased shadows and investigated the endless fascinating scents that accumulated overnight. This particular morning held the crisp promise of spring, with the first green shoots of grass beginning to push through the winter-brown earth. Clay stood at the kitchen window, the same window where Margaret had once watched for horses while she cooked, and marveled at how different the view looked now. Not the physical landscape, which remained unchanged, but the emotional landscape of his own perception. Where he'd once seen only reminders of loss, he now saw possibilities for growth. The ranch operation had thrived under his renewed attention. Clay had discovered that caring for Bella and Bandit had somehow recharged his interest in caring for everything else. The cattle were healthier, the horses more content, the property better maintained than it had been in years. It was as if the dog's presence had reminded him what it meant to take pride in providing for those who depended on him. But the most significant change was the one reflected in the letter Clay held in his hands, correspondence. From Linda Chen at the rescue organization. 3 weeks ago, Clay had taken in his first foster dog, an elderly German shepherd named Max, whose family could no longer care for him. Max was currently recovering from hip surgery. In the guest bedroom, Clay had converted into a temporary infirmary, learning to trust again after the trauma of abandonment. "We have another situation that might interest you," Linda's letter read. "A bonded pair of senior labs whose owner died last month. They're gentle souls, well-trained, but they're having trouble adjusting to shelter life. I think they might benefit from the kind of environment you've created there." Clay smiled as he read, already planning how he might accommodate 2 more dogs. The barn had space that could be converted to additional housing, and Betty Hartwell had offered to help with socializing and training. What had started as temporary care for 2 rescue puppies had become something much larger, a second chapter of his life devoted to providing sanctuary for animals in need. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Clay opened it to find Jake Morrison standing on his porch, looking healthier than Clay had seen him since the accident. His arm was healed, his color good, and his eyes held the clear focus of someone who'd emerged from crisis with a deeper appreciation for what mattered most in life. "Jake, what are you doing here?" "Road trip," Jake grinned, gesturing toward a rental car in the driveway. "Sarah's doing well enough to travel short distances now. She's waiting in the car, still gets tired easily, but she insisted on seeing the ranch." Clay's heart swelled as he watched Sarah Morrison carefully climb out of the passenger seat. Moving slowly but independently, she was thinner than he remembered, and she wore a knit cap that he suspected covered hair, still growing back from surgery. But her smile was radiant as she looked around at the ranch that had become her dog's home. Bella and Bandit, who'd been investigating something fascinating near the old garden plot, suddenly became aware of the visitors. For a moment, all 4 beings, 2 humans and 2 dogs, simply stared at each other across the yard. Then the dogs began to move, not with the frantic excitement Clay might have expected, but with something more complex, joy mixed with uncertainty, love tempered with loyalty to their new life. The reunion was gentle, careful, full of tears and laughter, and the kind of conversation that can only happen between species who've shared profound experience. Sarah knelt on the grass, while both dogs approached cautiously, their tails wagging, but their eyes checking back toward Clay, as if asking permission to love their former family without betraying their current one. "Look at them," Sarah whispered, running her hands through Bella's golden coat. "They're so confident, so healthy." "Clay, what you've done, what we've all done," Clay corrected gently. "You gave them the foundation of love and training that made them who they are. I just gave them space to be themselves." They spent the afternoon touring the ranch, with Jake and Sarah marveling at how thoroughly Bella and Bandit had integrated themselves into Clay's world. The dogs showed off their knowledge of ranch routines, demonstrated their friendship with the horses, and proudly guided their visitors to all their favorite spots. But at the end of each adventure, they returned to Clay's side, making their choice clear without drama or conflict. "No regrets?" Clay asked as Jake and Sarah prepared to leave. "None," Sarah said firmly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "This is where they belong now. We can see that. And we can also see how much they've given you." After their car disappeared down the county road, Clay found himself alone on his porch with his companions as the sun set behind the mountains. The evening was warm enough to sit outside, and all 3 of them seemed content to simply exist together in the gathering darkness. Clay thought about the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. A flash flood, a rescue mission by two devoted animals, a medical crisis that could have ended in tragedy, but instead led to healing and new beginnings. If someone had told him a year ago that he'd be planning to house multiple rescue dogs, that his grief for Margaret would transform into something productive and nurturing, that his isolated ranch would become a sanctuary for animals in need, he never would have believed it. But life, Clay had learned, was less about the story you planned to write and more about being open to the story that was trying to write itself. Margaret had taught him that love multiplied when shared, and Bella and Bandit had reminded him that healing often came in forms you didn't expect, from sources you'd never considered. As the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, Clay reached down to stroke Bella's head where it rested against his knee. "What do you think, girl? Ready for a couple more dogs around here?" Bella's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a sound that, after all these months, Clay had learned to interpret as enthusiastic approval for whatever adventure lay ahead. Sometimes, the smallest voices carried the most important messages. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those messages led you exactly where you needed to be.